Hey everybody, this is just going to be a quick little video tutorial on exporting from Photoshop, saving your files, and getting them ready to submit. So the first thing is when you're ready to actually export from Photoshop, export is actually probably the wrong word to use because there's an export setting here, but we're actually not going to use anything in here. We're going to do the Save As functionality, which if we go to Save As, we'll get this box here that allows us to save as a number of different file types. The important ones to remember are going to be the standard Photoshop files. This is what all of your working files should be saved as. There are a number of different versions of this, but I would just stick to the standard PSD, unless there's a reason later on to move on to the other ones, but in general, PSDs. We also have JPEG, of course, which is what you'll submit your final for this project in. This is going to be your smallest file type, generally speaking. Also, it previews fairly well on Teams and in general on the internet. Next, of course, we have PDF, which can be a problematic file type coming from Photoshop. We'll cover that. It can also be both very large and very small, depending on what settings you use. And then at the very bottom, we have PNG, which is a standard file type similar to JPEG that can also be both very small and very large, depending on file settings. And TIFF, which you've probably heard of before as the best for archival purposes. It can be the highest quality image that you'll save. Generally, again, probably not for submitting purposes, as if everyone in a class submits TIFF files, that folder gets very large very quickly. So for this assignment, you'll be saving everything as a JPEG. So I've exported a few of these images already just to sort of see the file size implications and also the quality implications of why you actually want to sometimes have a little bit larger file to keep your images looking good. So the first thing is the JPEG files, which are here. I've exported 3 different times the exact same image with 3 different settings. So the ultra low, which here from a distance doesn't look any different. However, if we start zooming in, we can see that we have a lot of what's called artifacting, and that's this sort of general blurriness that's happening on the page. There's a lot of sort of squares that are appearing, and that's just essentially the compression of the image sort of rearing its ugly head. If we go to Ultra, which is the cleanest version, which is actually crashing my computer to open for some reason. Let's try opening the high one. Anyways, so it doesn't usually crash your computer to open any of these files. They're really not that large. It's just my Windows Photos app is not working super well right now. But anyways, we don't have nearly as much of that compression happening as we zoom in. You can see the image is quite a bit cleaner. This is actually just the high version. If we go to the Ultra, it's even better. And of course, TIFF doesn't have any of that artifacting because it doesn't have any compression whatsoever. I've also saved a version as a PDF. Both with flattening settings, which I'll cover in a second, and non-flattening settings. The difference here is essentially if you flatten an image, you get rid of all these layers that are part of Photoshop. If you don't flatten it, you keep these, which essentially keeps your editing functionality for later times. However, if you're exporting a PDF to share with someone else and you're not intending for them to edit your file, you really don't need these, and they're just extra data that is unnecessarily in your file. So you can see the difference here. If you flatten it, it's 28,000 kilobytes versus unflattened is 115. The original Photoshop file that I'm working with right now is 136,000. That's the file that you want to keep. That's the one you want to continue working in. That's your full editing capabilities. I also flattened a version and exported it just while also keeping the Photoshop file. And it went down to 28,000 megabytes, so there was quite a big difference there, and that's just the data that's required to keep all these different layers active and able to be edited. So when you're doing a save as, let's say you're going to save as, let's go to PDF first, which I always have trouble finding, so here it is. This button here, there's a little box that says layers, so this is effectively flattening your image. If layers are turned on, it's not flattened. If you uncheck that, it is flattened. The next thing, I'm just going to go through these. It'll bring up this little Adobe PDF file compression thing, which essentially there's a few different things. Generally, I keep it on high quality, We will cover this extensively when we go over your portfolio, as this is really important. But one thing to know is PDFs actually are better thought of as sort of file folders. They can have multiple different types of files within them. So a PDF can actually have a JPEG in it. So you see here the compression is at the JPEG, and that's why they're a little confusing. So if you are sharing a PDF file with someone, generally speaking, they don't need your layers, so you want to make sure that that is turned off and that the image is flattened. The other way is you can actually just flatten your image ahead of time by right-clicking on the layer panel and just hitting the flatten button, which essentially it'll give you a little warning, makes all of your layers disappear, and it looks like this now. I'm not going to do that, but that is how you would do that if you wanted to. So next we'll do save as, and we'll go down to JPEG, which is what you should save as for this assignment. You can see here we're not given the option to include layers, but we do get some options here on essentially image quality. My general recommendation is to stay between 9 and 10, as I find beyond that is sort of diminishing returns with just much higher file sizes. So we can see here we get a preview of what those sizes look like. So 10 for this particular file is 3.6 megabytes, whereas if I went up to 12, that's where I get the 7.3 megabytes. So twice the size, not necessarily twice the quality. You could, of course, go all the way down to the lowest quality, makes it very small, but that image will be useless to anyone and everyone. So probably don't ever do that. I have no idea why anyone would ever save an image at the lowest JPEG quality. So between 9 or 10, that's a good standard to work with, and just leave it at this sort of standard baseline format. And that's how you will save to export for this assignment. But just to cover a couple others, so you will get similar options if you go to TIFF. You want to make sure that if you're saving it for archival purposes and you're not intending to keep the layers, that you'll turn this off. That will make a flattened image. If you keep it on, it essentially is very similar to a PSD file or a Photoshop file, where you can continue editing it as if it was a Photoshop file, and it's really not very much of a difference. The same thing happens if you are exporting a PDF. You have that same functionality. If you leave it in there, it just allows you to continue editing in Photoshop as if it were the original file. For the sake of organization, I always recommend saving your files that you're working on as actual PSDs, and those are the ones you want to work on, and those are the ones you're keeping. JPEGs and PNGs and TIFFs are really, I like to flatten them and export them so they are separate images that are just for submitting, for keeping for archival records and things like that. And again, without the layers option. The next thing I was going to cover real quickly is image size versus canvas size. So if I go to image size here, we can see that it gives me my pixel count, which in this image is 4,000 by 3,000 essentially. And it tells me my width and my height and my resolution. These three things are entirely tied together. So an image that is 56 inches wide by 42 at 72 pixels is the same as an image that is 300 pixel DPI, or pixels per inch, that is 13 by 10. Since these things are locked and this resample button here is turned off, these changes are sort of, they have no effect on the actual image. It's just all relative to one another. So since this assignment should be exported at 11 by 17, I could set the width to 17. The height will default to whatever it should be. In this case, it's actually going to be a little bit over, but that's okay for now, 12.75. Just make sure resample is off, or it will dramatically change your image. So if we turn resample on and then start making changes, essentially it will try to add pixels or delete pixels in order to create the new image if resample is on. This never works particularly well, meaning it is sort of an option of last resort, as essentially it's trying to create, if you're trying to make an image that's larger, which is what it's doing in this case, it's trying to create data that doesn't exist. And it's never going to be that great. It's always going to be an approximation. Now downsampling is the other option where, say I went and make this 10 inches, it's decreasing pixels, and in general, that image that's going to be an output is going to be fine. It's not going to be as high quality as the one that you started with because it has less pixels, inherently less information as part of it, but you can always go down. Generally, you can never go back up again. Is a sort of good way to think about it. So actually I meant to keep that result. So let's just say I wanted the width to be 17 as for the 11 by 17 output. The next thing is the height. So I'm actually going to go to canvas size here and change this from per pixels to inches and just set my height to be 11. Essentially what it's going to do is it's just going to crop down to at 11 by 17. Now my image already had these sort of black bars in it that I just used to sort of represent the crop that I intended for the image. So once I have the sort of 17 width, I could also just select out the area that I want and go down to the crop tool and hit crop. Now this image is exactly 17 inches wide. The height is not, but it would fit on 11 by 17, so that would also be fine. However, one thing I always recommend doing is if you're going to start cropping your image, save a copy first. So I would do a save as, and as a PSD file, save, example cropped. The reason being, you may find reasons later on where you need a larger image. Say you're incorporating this into your portfolio, and it'd be great if it were just a little bit taller to better match some of the other images you're trying to balance it with. In which case, having the original version that is uncropped will be tremendously useful for you. So I would always keep the uncropped version because you can always come back and crop it a different way. So say you wanted maybe a square image. Maybe you're putting this on Instagram or something where you need a square format. Oops. Try that one more time. Image crop. I just, why is it not working? There it is. Perfect little square. Maybe you'll want this at some point. So if you save the version that keeps the full image, you can always crop it later. But it is something to be aware of as for particular exports, you may have to get it down to a certain size, or you may decide that the composition of the image really looks better, something like that, which I think in this case, for this particular image I created, it does look better like this. So I may want to actually crop this for my export. But in this case, again, the important thing was the image size. I adjusted the width without the resample on to be 17 inches so that it would fit that 17-inch canvas. And then I can adjust the overall crop down how I want beyond that. Okay, so that's all for this demo. Thank you.